Welcome back to SideQuest VIII, episode 23. Back with me, my constant companion and perennial party member, Wes Schantz. Wes, how are you doing today?
I am here. I am doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well too. I'm excited to talk today about fighting against Fujin and Raijin, Mobile Type 8, Adel, very strange thing she did, so-called junctioning Renoa. Very interesting ways that Final Fantasy VIII afflicts one's autonomy, either physically or consciously. Um, and so talking a little bit about that, and then talking about time compression, which we laid out the intricacies and perhaps obfuscations of that plan last time. This mixture of Dr. Odine's enigmatic personality as well as Laguna's meandering, erratic personality. We fought some ancient witches from the past,
That's
including a
true.
sort of super witch. Um, approached Ultimatia's castle, and in my case, I foolishly just kind of ran in there and tried to see what I could do. And I did wreck the first monster, a sort of male sphinx.
Oh,
But the second one, I had this very powerful counterattack, and I was not prepared to deal with it. So I am at the castle, not past the castle.
okay.
But I also wanted to mention to the viewers that we're embarking on yet another project, which is itself a recurrent sort of project. We are reigniting night school with Mr. Daniel Babcock. We had our first show last night. We talked about Hail of Fire, and I think that'll be interesting to people who are of a more literary bent. Listen to this show and wanted to recommend that as well. But so, Wes, we are back from a hiatus. You were traveling, I was traveling, and now we are close to the end. What is it that you'd like to dive into today, or maybe if you want to describe, there wasn't a lot that happened plot wise, but there were some I thought significant moments, extremely significant moments in this particular swathe of playthrough.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we were talking 3 weeks ago and kind of got cut off really about halfway through what we would normally have discussed, I think. So there's some stuff that we had left over, and I'm trying to look back at notes and things, but I remember you wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea of the child soldier as
Yes.
a structuring plot key or theme or both. Um, because I think the week before that or sometime before that, I had kind of arrived at a place in just blathering where I was like realizing that I still have kind of a problem with the way that that appears in this game. And I think that it's, we keep circling around like, what are the things that people don't like about this game? And I think that list has gotten pretty long at this point, but there are some sort of core pieces to it. And for myself personally, I think I've kind of come to terms with most of the stuff on that list. Uh, Seeing the game for its own, um, you know, on its own terms, right, and appreciating it, and not comparing it to its precursors and other great games of that era, and just sort of, you know, getting into it. But the child soldier thing, it still rankles with me, and I wanted to give us a chance to kind of talk through that a little bit. We never really uh, settled on a good answer for the way that masculinity and femininity and beauty and fashion, right, are kind of fitting into the game as well, because that was the other element there. And I think it was specifically with the sorceresses, right? The appearance of the sorceresses and the ways that that's portrayed that we were gonna also try to dig into a little bit more. Um, so those are two kind of leftover pieces that we could start with either or both if you want to kind of refresh on where you were at with that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to get into those. And I also want to talk about Fujin and Raijin and Fujin
Yeah.
speaking in these sentences and calling Seifer a puppet and how Seifer might be sort of like a cloud figure in this instance. And so perhaps that's the difference between squall and cloud. One is in motion, or one in, I don't know. Both seem to be passive in some ways. The squall is pushed by the winds, right? It's not self-motivated. But something I wanted to say about the child soldier motif is that this does happen to be a sort of common anime motif. If you look at, say, Naruto, it's about these child ninjas that go out and fight for life and death, and then the various Gundams tend to be very young people. Same with Neon Genesis Evangelion. And part of the reason that often child soldiers or children soldiers are employed is not to suggest that this is an ideal solution to the problem of soldiers, but that most of these games and shows are written for people of that age and younger, and the questions that are being raised are questions that are particular to people of that age. And so, even though it is almost certainly not the case that like some 17-year-old would be an elite soldier in, say, the U.S. military in particular, they couldn't even enlist by that time. You'll find people who manifest as like 21, 22-year olds, even like Sephiroth, very young, as like general level people in a military, as if they are so prodigious that, you know, by the time they're 14 to 18, which happens to be sort of the age range of the seeds, I think they're mostly 17 and 18.
Yeah.
All basically the same age, that they could have attained some sort of skill that is not in any way possible in the real world. It would take, you know, double, triple the amount of training time to attain such ranks. In particular, I think Squall, you know, the whole team being pushed out into that crazy mission in the first place, and
Yeah.
Sid choosing Squall to be leader as a 17-year-old, you know, not even old enough, at least in this world, to buy cigarettes yet, and certainly not to drink it in the U.S. anyway. But so I'm I'm not trying to sidestep the question, because it is true that in Final Fantasy the characters have been a little bit older in general. I think Yuffie was a teenager in Final Fantasy VII, but even Cloud was like 21. The characters were slightly older. Um, and in Final Fantasy VI, I get the sense that again they're like in their 20s. But
Exactly.
I think this is sort of like how with epic literature, time doesn't sort of pass. Like even though Odysseus is gone for 10 years at a war and then an additional 10 years on the sea, he sort of comes home as just the same Odysseus, but with some new experiences. I think part of why Final Fantasy VIII does this, again, is not to valorize the concept of the child soldier, but to make the characters relevant to the people who were the initial market of the game in the same way that animes often
Right.
do, and that
Right.
that
Yeah.
is part of the unrealistic or fantastic aspect of it. That in fact, I think this is a conscious decision on their part to move away from verisimilitude, and but as I can see from our different readings of it, uh, that doesn't necessarily come off.
Yeah.
And but so I'm not trying to give like cut them any slack, so much as to say that this is I think this is part of a larger motif within the sort of cluster of media or and genres that this work finds itself in.
That makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think from the genre point of view, the uh, the way that they approach this game, um, having this sort of speech and relationships and uh, just a lot of the ways that the characters interact, um, it does read like they are younger, and it is so in one way, um, yeah, more like connect, like easier for the audience to connect with for that age range of audience, right? And then in another way, harder for the audience to connect with once the audience is older and looking back on things.
Mm.
Um, and I think since that's where I'm at with the, the gameplay this time, and I've made it much further into the game, um, I'm seeing that the ways that these characters are like forced to deal with their world is so sort of incongruous with their actual age and emotional maturity and everything. It's just yeah, it's really um, it's really painful actually, you know, to think about um, the the kind of real world child soldiers that um, that's where my mind goes, right? That in many cases are raised again with sort of no memory of anything other than that. Um, and so I feel like this game has kind of gotten a hold of something that is so big and so heavy um, that it isn't, because of the way that the the developers sort of downplay long or involved discussions of character development in favor of just sort of focusing on really the one relationship between Squall and Renoa, and not really doing any significant world building through exploration or quests or anything like that. Right, that's all secondary. It's very much streamlined, and we're following these characters on their journey to um, save their world. Um, I feel like there was an opportunity that this game missed to really explore that theme in a more nuanced fashion. I feel like the closest it comes is in the scene where they're finally having their heart to heart with the basketball court, and all of the characters are together and realizing that they had lost those memories. Um, but we don't see anything on that level of self-reflection from the characters, again with the exception of the Squall Renoa relationship that develops again each time that they are kind of having their promise in the flower field, or um, they're rescued on the ship and all that. um, so I think there's um, there's things about the fantasy that when you look back, and I'm sure this is true of all of the games in different ways, when you look back playing them later, I think that you can see like some really dark, heavy, you know, just profound um, connections to the real world and to people's experience that the game, because of what it's doing, because of the way it's developed in the story it's interested in telling, just can't really do justice to. And I think that's okay. I'm not saying that's like a unique fault of this game, um, because even Earthbound, Xenogears, other Final Fantasy games, I think there's examples in there that we could definitely identify as well. Um, but for some reason, um, I think because of the spare nature of the storytelling in this game, it just sort of leapt out at me more. And maybe again, just because of my own background and biases of like working with kids, um, and now having kids, thinking about the kind of loss of innocence and the loss of a childhood that being a child soldier really conjures up. It's um, it's it's really terrifying. Um, and I guess I just don't um, yeah, I don't get that sense as strongly when I'm playing, replaying that is, other games that have, I feel like, aged better with me personally. Um, so that's kind of where I was going with that comment, I guess, as I've been trying to chew on that. I hope that that's a little bit more
No, it does.
fleshed out.
It makes sense, but it will be interesting because I have a response that may in fact make your rhetorical flourish more than a rhetorical flourish, because I think that your reaction to this is because of the differing genre that Final Fantasy VIII is compared to Final Fantasy VI, VII, and Xenogears. I think those are all epics. And in Final Fantasy VIII's attempt to open itself to female gamers, it moved into romance, and romance has different generic conventions and focuses on different aspects of existence. And so we don't get powerful reflections on suicide like Final Fantasy VI, nor of being a mass murderer incapable of harnessing one's own power or understanding one's past like in Xenogears. And then in Final Fantasy VII, again, we see an actual mental collapse. These stories do tell, they delve into psychic trauma. And were this an epic like Seven, I think that the fact that these people had lost their memories and had been fighting basically perhaps an eternal return, sort of cyclical, never-ending world. If they were more speculative, Squall is anything but speculative. Right. This would be a very Westworld labyrinthine, even the ideas of finding brothers in a labyrinth. It would be a very interesting story to tell. But and I agree that that we do miss that telling of it, and it is different from Final Fantasy VI and VII for that reason. But I think that's because they moved towards a romance, and so something interesting about that is I wanted to mention another reason that sometimes these games or stories tend to miss what we're looking for at a different age isn't just because of our biases, but because of, say, the differing motifs and themes focused on, and the different things happening in the world at any given time. Obviously, right now there are child soldiers that are dying in the Middle East every day, as well as children who are not soldiers, and that affects one's reading and playing of a video game. If one, has one's finger on the pulse to some extent. Also, a big issue today that was not an issue in 1998, 1999 is what it means to have a trans identity. And so just to give people a little bit of background, this is geographical language. Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, these are Latinic prefixes for near and across. And so when people are listed as cisgender or transgender, this is a geographical metaphor that's being employed. But something about one of the characters in Final Fantasy VIII that might make one perk up their ears, and in fact does make people perk up their ears and raise their eyebrows, now is the representation of Adel. Adel is a 14-foot tall, long, red-haired, sort of looks like a male bodybuilder. Seems to have male pecs and a male physiognomy, but has a skirt, is referred to as she, and is part of a succession of sorceresses who are gendered. And so obviously Adel, within the context of the text, is a woman, and there's no question. Adel is referred to as a woman, and as a woman, and there's no question. Because of the dynamics of the game and I would say also the dynamics of society at the end of the 20th century, that even though Adel is a very curious looking woman, more like what might have been described as a transvestite at that time, a cross-dresser, Adel is more of a problem these days, and I think that reflects the changing mores and sort of focuses or foci of the time. But though we might problematize the representation of Adel now within the scope of the game, the question is answered. Adel is a woman, and it is left to us to wonder whether Adel's presentation, her gigantic size and her loss of feminine attributes, whether that is a result of her possession of magic and maybe even her use of magic. Does she manifest more in a more masculine way because of her use of magic to usurp power? Maybe not. It's hard to say because, of course, Ultimacia and Idea sort of do the same thing. Though Idea is under the influence of Ultimacia. Idea seems to have some corruption too, with sort of black tendrils moving up her face as if she's starting to rot. Ultimacia, I think, is partly, does she have bird feet? Something like, I don't know. She might not. I might be making something up, but she does have horns. And so there's something interesting within the scope of the game that we might miss if we only look through our current social lens. we could just focus on Adel and representation of Adel, but I think the more interesting, larger concept is to focus on the representation of the sorceresses themselves, and to see whether the possession of magic, like the possession of dark side force in the Star Wars universe, physically affects them. We know that Emperor Palpatine, for example, looks so heinously ugly and wrinkled because of his overuse of Force lightning, which is a dark side power. So using the dark side of the Force makes one physically uglier. This goes back to Milton's Paradise Lost, where the more evil Satan gets, the more he looks less divine and even bestial near the end, right, as a snake. And hiss is what he's met. He's met with hisses when he returns to hell, because every creature is turned to a snake. In any case, so I think I'm not trying to diminish the contemporary questions about Adele's representation, but I think that could, if we did over focus on that, like I said, we could miss the larger question that is actually consciously put before us by the game developers. It seems like, you know, these sorceresses, they a lot worse happens to them than just losing their memory. They and this is sort of a concept that's borne out, I think, in Final Fantasy VII remake, that the Mako exposure doesn't just give extra powers to soldiers, but also sort of limits their lifespans. It makes them burn a little too hot, like they're perpetually on a stimulant. And this new character Roach really acts like it. That he not a lot. Many people hate this new character. In any case, I wanted to say that I agree with you entirely that this game does not hit on that trauma or the child trauma, and that particularly is interesting, or not interesting, but resonant at this time and in this place in the 2020s, the Roaring 20s. But that I think that's because this, like you said, this game is trying to tell a different story. It's trying to be in a different genre, but that makes moving from the epic genre, I think, makes people, often males, dislike the jump for sophisticated and less sophisticated reasons. And I think you have very sophisticated reasons for disliking the jump, because it misses the opportunity to tell a very weighty tale, and prefers instead to tell sort of a love story. And yes, to say that they've just changed the genre is not to say that that makes the game impervious to that criticism, and or in comparison to Seven. But I would prefer to say that rather than they missing it and limiting the impact of this game as it is, it's just a game that doesn't have the same sort of psychological impact as Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, I think the way that we see characters, as you pointed out at the start, right, losing agency or having their physical appearance and their, you know, mental stability, etc., transformed, uh, is very strongly represented here. So there's, I mean, a character like Seifer, who we've watched since the beginning, being on this trajectory. Um, he here has a really interesting transformation,
Yeah.
and it's coupled with the way that Adel and Renoa then become junctioned
Yes.
briefly in that battle, right? And
Yeah.
so I think, I mean, yeah, there's like some mini bosses and stuff, and there's the setting itself of the Lunatic Pandora, um, that centers on that crystal pillar. Is that what it's called? The structure that is kind of at the core. Um, and that of course is essential to the Final Fantasy series in lots of ways. So the way that it appears here finally, after not being really a thing at all for so long, is quite interesting. Like, so we've seen this place, like we visually have explored it with Laguna back in the past, not knowing what it was, just some thing they had to do for their mission, right? Typical. Um, and then you had the option, I guess, of exploring a little bit of it when it flies over the city. But if you mistime it, if you don't get to the right location at the right time, uh, there's no real consequence to it, but you don't get to go aboard. And if you do certain things in the past, there's some treasures and spells and things that you can access in the present of the game. So you could get those like a little earlier, I guess. But then you get to a certain point where you face the mobile Type 8 weapon. Uh, it has those kind of sorceress-like powers of telekinesis, and it just throws you out of there before you can really accomplish whatever it was that Zell was trying to accomplish. And then now we're able to fully explore. There's different enemies. I guess if you don't have the enemy encounters turned off, you can face like the behemoth, another classic, Final Fantasy monster, and some other, big scary enemies or whatever. Um, but then there's also this boss rush element to the game here. There's a series of boss battles in quick succession. And I had a lot of trouble actually with the mobile Type 8. That was the first boss battle that I was knocked out in quite a while. I want to say I was only knocked out in regular encounters before this too. But I had the Phoenix. You remember the Phoenix pinion. You can get it in a couple of different ways. And if you use it, it will automatically, at least there's like a chance that it will automatically revive your whole party by summoning Phoenix when everyone's dead. And so that happened, and I survived the battle as a result. It was a nail biter though. But the other boss battles were not particularly difficult. I did want to steal a lot of aura spells from Seifer, but after he defeats Odin, then Gilgamesh comes in after a certain number of turns or something, and just blows him away from the battle, which is weird and interesting in this other way in which like junctioning and GFs are being kind of played with in this part of the game. So anyway, yeah, and then of course there's Fujin and Raijin that we've got to look at their transformation here as well. So as far as like plot stuff, yeah, I think there's some key things that are happening here, but more interesting certainly is the way that characters are changing, transforming. GFs indeed are transforming as well. So yeah, so where do you want to dive in now that we've kind of covered that leftover stuff a little bit?
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I do want to think about the idea of boss clustering at the end of the game to sort of signify the end of the game to really bring the gravity on, because it's as if the exploration goes down to 0, but then the showing the mastery of the combat goes up to 100. And this is when one needs to have played the card game and junctioned and know how to set up one's characters for the long haul. We get Seifer, or sorry, Fujin Raijin, mobile Type 8, which can hit really hard. Then this odd mechanic of finding Adel while she absorbs HP from Renoa, and Renoa herself has limited HP, so she needs to be kept alive. So GFs can't be used. So all these weird, and then followed by a succession of witches that we have to fight over and over and over in sort of last man standing style, like a brawler. And then we get to Ultimatia's castle, where all of a sudden all of our abilities are sort of sealed away, and so all of a sudden the final test has begun, even though we are not yet. I can't remember whether we're on disc 4. I think we're right after you beat Adele, right? You go to disc 4.
It's between the Seifer and Adele fights, which is very
Yes.
strange. So you
Yes.
can kind of get like locked into this part because of the nature of the. I mean, I guess you could leave. Yeah, you're not forced to go forward at this point. You can go back on your ship. You could leave. You could do whatever. But in terms of like the plot, you're very much in the middle of a bunch of stuff, and it's just sort of like, okay, now we got to go to this 4, but we're jumping right back into the next boss battle. Like this just happened. Renoa was just stolen away by Seifer somehow. Whatever.
This is not the study guide for the final exam. This is the final exam sort of flung onto one. And by the time one is at the Lunatic Pandora going through these fights with encounter none on, as I have, so I don't gain any levels, so that Ultimatia doesn't get any harder. It's stark. It's like, okay, this is the difference between, your warm classroom when your teacher's being nice, and then, the teacher handing the final exam and saying, now do it. And you better have studied hard. And if you didn't, this is not going to be the best day of your life. And in this game, I have no doubt that the Lunatic Pandora or what immediately comes after it ends many runs right at the very end.
Yeah.
Um, because I don't know, it's an unforgiving game in that way. It reminds me of the notion of the Oxford term, which is you don't have to go to class, you just have to sit for your exams. Final Fantasy VIII is kind of easy, kind of hard, depending on how you play, until you get to this part where it is just hard. Even very good players who are very well set up have to use their heads, have to make sure that they junction things appropriately. Then when they get to Ultimatia's castle, have to choose the right ways to mix their parties. Again, it's like Final Fantasy VII. You have to use all of your players again, and they'll be randomly chosen for the final battle. So it's kind of a bummer. And if you only have 3 really strong ones, or yeah, are used to playing like that, or you're going to have to use some interesting strategies. But all of a sudden, the difficulty has been shot up. And so I want to talk a little bit of agency of exploration. The gravity, the tracting beam is on us. There's no getting out of it now. And we've talked about that. But right, we've talked a lot about autonomy and agency. And so I think we get some really interesting moments of talking about that. And in the same way that we really explored that concept in Final Fantasy VII, when Jenova at the end of just one calls Cloud a puppet, and says and suggests that he's having his strings pulled, that he doesn't have agency at all. But first, we have Seifer being told that he's a puppet by Fujin and Raijin. Fujin decides to be completely articulate about this, so she's finally serious, and they finally abandon him because he's abandoned himself. He's allowing himself to be controlled by Ultimatia in a way similar to how Ultimatia controls others. Except for with him, she seems to manipulate his dreams and use rhetoric, whereas she just psychologically forces herself into the heads of others. So it's a very similar effect, but maybe a different mechanism. I also wanted to mention that Adel it has a sort of human centipede middle role here, in that she junctions Renoa, but it is Ultimatia in Adel's head controlling Adel at this point. And so Seifer, like a rapist, takes Renoa and then shoves her into Adel. And I'm not going to say you loosely, analogously, but analogously in a world that has differing mechanisms from ours. So I think the concept is in fact appropriately extended, because Ultimatia forces herself into the minds of those she's with, and then Renoa, and I'm not even sure what the ontology of this is, sort of physically, psychically fused to Adel. I didn't even know a human could be junctioned to another human. I just thought these sort of transcendental guardian forces could. But it's sort of horrifying because she's like physically, you can see some parts of Renoa, but then she seems to be sort of fused to Adel, who is actually Ultimatia. And so Ultimatia is actually committing sort of a rape at 2 levels, psychologically taking over the body of Adel while fusing the body of Renoa to Ultimatia. Adel can then absorb HP from Renoa. So there's even though Renoa is fused to her, Adel Ultimatia is like a parasite on Renoa. Renoa can actually die because of this. And so I just wanted to mention that. So now we have Seifer sort of being manipulated, losing his friends, forcing Renoa into this strange loss of autonomy of her own body, with Adel, who herself had lost her freedom and then got her freedom back just to lose her psychological freedom to Ultimatia. And so questions of agency, as we lose our own agency for exploring, I think are exploding in this work right now. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, and what junctioning seems to be.
Yeah, so we had a little hint of this with the idea of the Elone machine that was being
Yes.
developed right, to use those powers. But it's not the same really, because it's not like the person herself is involved in the mechanism. And whatever junctioning is, it seems like it is a way to transfer magic and to trade memory, right? Like up to this point, that's kind of the exchange that we've seen. But in this case, yeah, it's more direct. It's like the physical body is being added onto, absorbed into, attached, right? In a really kind of gross and conjugal way. Um, and the thing that's being exchanged seems to involve life force, right? The HP itself. And it's, yeah, a parasitic relationship. It's unclear if like some of the magical abilities, the sorceress powers themselves is also being like absorbed, and I guess that's like implied because Renoa doesn't do anything in the battle. She's just hanging there and is limp. Um, so the kind of absorption process, I guess, would ultimately involve her fully disappearing into and giving up all of her, health and magic to Adel's body slash Ultimecia's control, right? And so the stakes are high in this battle. It's tricky, like mechanically, because you can't use any attacks that hit all enemies. You could accidentally defeat Renoa, and that ends it. You can't revive her for some reason. I guess this is again some more of that kind of plot slash mechanic um, friction that we've seen lots of times. But anyway, so um, the the way that this plays out, like visually, is echoing a couple of things, right? It's a way like of recalling Squall when he was being tortured by Seifer, right? And it's cruciform, and so it's therefore Christianity itself, right, is being sort of questioned. And again, Seifer has those crosses on his shoulder. Those are pretty prominent here. Apparently he'll do a limit break where he does a kind of cross and then does some extra things. He always had the fire cross limit break, but there's like a new one that he can do in the last battle with him here if somehow he has low HP but doesn't get defeated. Anyway, so he's like closely associated with
Mm.
that kind of suffering, that kind of deeply symbolic appropriation of the image for this purpose of like representing this character and his particular problems and issues and things. And that's interesting. Again, not really fully explored. And that's maybe again back to your point about like the kind of story that we're in here. But anyway, so he sets this up and then he steps back, and it's really strange to see that switch take place, right? He was the knight. Now he's not. He's kind of given up on that. And he seems to be purely, you know, a thief, like you said, in the root sense of the word, a rapist, and not heroic, even ostensibly, like not at all. So when you go to the stage of actually like taking this battle on, um, there's a way to like heal Renoa. You can take regen spells and apply them, and so she's continually being healed. And so it's not really that hard of a battle once you sort of understand the um, the twist, you know. And I feel like that's the case for all of these things. Like you're gonna lose some of these battles the first try, but if you can think them through and understand what's going on, you have a pretty good shot of surviving, even if it's hard. Um, the only problem, the real problem, I feel like, is if you kind of get stuck and can't go exploring and grinding and not in the sense of leveling up because you don't want to do that, but in the sense of getting items or spells that you need to junction to yourself. Um, so like it's sort of just re-putting the focus on how important junctioning is throughout the game, right? In this one instance, it's doing it in a really weird and pretty creepy way, but it's sort of like reminding what's been true all along is like junctioning is the heart of this whole game. That's the whole thing. And so if you can get powerful healing spells, powerful magic spells, you don't want to actually use them, right? You might kill Renault. No, don't do that, but junction them to your stats and you'll be fine. You just can slowly whittle away her Adel's, that is, HP, and keep Renault alive, and it's all good.
I agree. I think that's yeah, right. Now and then when we fight against Ultimacia, she will pull some interesting junctions
Mm-hmm.
that we will not expect. She'll junction something out of Squall's imagination, and then she'll junction herself unto herself. And so that makes me wonder whether whatever the mechanism of junctioning is, there are it's sort of like putting coffee or some different thing in the coffee maker. It seems like magic is the most appropriate thing, though it's costly. It costs one's memories. Um, but other things seem to be capable of being junctioned to one, particularly if one is a sorceress and so has some sort of native level of magic. So we don't see anybody but Ultimacia or somebody or a sorceress possessed by Ultimacia capable of junctioning anything besides GFs or magic. All right. Adele is herself occupied by Ultimacia at this point, and then she junctions Renoa, who is herself a sorceress. And so, is there also like sort of a time physical compression thing already happening there, and that there are three sorceresses all there at once? This just highlights, I think, more questions to me about the differences between paramagic and the magic that goes back to Hein that created the succession of sorceresses. Is it because they're all sort of magical beings that are already joined together in a sort of linear, maybe cyclical temporal way that they can be junctioned to each other, or or is there something like an essence or soul within somebody that is ontologically similar to something in one's imagination,
Mm-hmm.
that is ontologically similar to, or is that what Ultimacia is ultimately doing? She's like putting her soul on the line. Like her soul will be destroyed if she loses when she junctions herself unto herself.
That
Um
that seems to be, yeah, the implication of the plan, though, is that we can't simply defeat whatever her soul is that she's sending back, right? It has to be fused back with her, right? So that idea of junctioning herself to herself, um, like only then is she going to be defeated once and for all, and kind of set us free from the chains of this infinite loop thing, this time compression thing that we've got going on. And and on the other hand, yeah, we've seen already like the power of love motif, right? So this like good quality of love, and the kind of connection power that you know Elene has been using all along is quasi junctioning Squall and Laguna, right? It's like you basically are giving all of the things that are junction to Squall to Laguna. So it's kind of like a cutting out the middleman thing. Um, Almost like the inverse of whatever it is that Adele is doing with Renoa here, of like junctioning her body to her body. You know, it's just like purely taking what's junction to one and then becomes junction to the other through this connection that Elena can establish. So yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of ways that we're seeing this, like variations on a theme of junctioning slash connection, um, and and the thing that happens with the GF, right? That by defeating it in battle, it joins your party. That seems to be like a way of like mediating or something, like the really bad thing that Adele slash Ultimecia are up to, and the really benign thing that Elone slash Laguna are up to. Like somewhere in between is what your party does, where you do the violence, but then you receive the alliance of the GF, right? And so when Seifer like straight up kills Odin, uh, that's really shocking. You know, he doesn't like take Odin over; he just like ends him. And I think that's like again like a symbol of the kind of nihilism that Seifer has kind of finally fully embraced at this point of the game. That he can't even like try to build himself up in any way. He can only take away. He can only cut down.
things down.
Yeah.
That's interesting because you're making me think that perhaps even a larger conversation to have about junctioning is that this is a game about costs and connections,
Mm.
and that choices have consequences and costs. And this is something that uh, this story does very well in showing the path of Seifer, who effectively is the opposite of Cecil from Final Fantasy IV.
Mm.
Cecil, the Dark Knight, who becomes a hero of light. Seifer is is a deluded knight who becomes clearly at best a dark knight, and is taking and the cost of his choices cost him his connections to his own dreams, to his best friends, and even to his old comrades, and they cost him everything, they except for ultimately his life, interestingly enough. But like we were talking about junctioning appropriate things versus inappropriate things, it seems like junctioning is never totally appropriate. This is some sort of strange original sin thing, right? Dr. Odin helping to develop of paramagic. It's not something that's natural to the world. It is artificial, technological, and it has this huge technological cost. Again, like the use of Mako or Genova cells, which are either synthesized or literally alien in Final Fantasy VII, but that Squall's connection to the people around him has become deeper, not only to Renoa, but to everybody at Garden, and his role has become larger, and so much to the point that his connection to his friends is supposed to save him from time compression, and all of theirs as well. And so I think part of what the witches are doing, the sorceresses, is showing something that the antagonists often represent very well in the Final Fantasy series, which is though they have such great gifts, Sephiroth, Kefka, that they're Ultimacia, that in pursuing this sort of monopolistic, despotic power, they cost themselves connection, human connection with anybody else, and that is the ultimate sort of defeat. That kind of is so unnatural, so against Aristotle's maxim that one is a political animal, that it's like the nature of reality actually works against Kefka or Sephiroth or Ultimacia, which makes sense because they're all so powerful that it would seem that the characters themselves would not be able to handle them, right? Sephiroth and Kefka are basically god level. I mean, and Kefka is actually a god. He has to come down from heaven to fight you in Final Fantasy. He has to condescend to fight you. And again, with Sephiroth too, he has all the characters in stasis, telekinetically just held up. He allows the final fight. And so but again, these junctioning something so inappropriate as another person to take away someone's autonomy like that, again, seems to have a sort of natural consequence within the scope of Final Fantasy VIII, as to put a death sentence on Ultimacia. It's not even, like a legal like death sentence like one might get for first degree rape, or one might be sterilized and put into to jail forever, especially if it's with a weapon in the United States. And for first degree or murder, one would certainly go to jail or get get life in prison, or possibly the death penalty, depending on whether one lives in Texas or not. So I think what I'm trying to say is one can feel the role of the hero of light, in that it is part of the nature of the cosmos that we are taking place in, that seems to want us teleologically to rid it of this anti-life force, this Necron-like force, whether it be Sephiroth, who is absolute and alone and wants to be absolute and alone, or Kefka, who has become, again, not even part of three gods, but the sole god of this world, or eventually Kuja, who is sort of similar, but I guess Ultimacia is better. And so we are, and I think Squall might hate this. We are then taking the role of a tool of fate, and thus are fated. not
Mm-hmm.
not choose. I mean, we have to choose to embrace our fate, but maybe that's a, maybe that's a me just playing with words to say that. But just like now we have to fight. There's no exploration. The path forward is basically straight, even though it's not quite an Ultimation's castle. There is a little strategy, and it is a little puzzling. But now Squall, who wants agency so much, is cast as the one that needs to free the cosmos of this parasitic presence Ultimacia, who wishes to bend the laws of reality to her will in order to unnaturally, artificially make herself the single thing in existence. And so Squall has to uh, unbend reality and defeat her, get her, and I don't know, uh, reorder existence in such a way that it either becomes linear or infinite or cyclical in the way that it ordinarily becomes. But it it's almost as if, because of Ultimacia trying to take away choice from all people and creatures and living things in reality, that she takes away Squall's, in particular, because he is forced to be the one that will defeat her.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the other paradox of this design element, right, of the kind of cosmic necessity for justice to be brought upon the force that's trying to destroy everything, right, is that when you do that, the game ends. You know,
The game,
that is the end of the game by definition. So like, you're kind of I feel like I had this problem a lot as a kid too, where I would get to the end of games and not really want to fight the final battle.
yeah,
You'd sort of stop there, and like 5 years later, 10 years later, you'd go back and actually play it and see what happened in the end credits, because you don't want to leave that world. That's how I always felt, or that's a way to like explain my like stopping at the end of games without completing them. And so I think there's something to um, the theme of this game putting so much emphasis on Squall's freedom or lack thereof that makes that particularly salient here. Uh, and I will say, like, it is possible once you have um, come to the castle with its giant chains that are holding it to the earth, to go through these portals that are also there, which almost seem like they're not part of Ultimecia's realm at all, but something that Idea slash Renoa is doing, or Elone, I guess, maybe, because they have the look of Idea's house. But these portals you can walk through and they'll take you back to various locations around the world map. So you do have a chance to actually go back and buy some stuff or find some spells or whatever. You can actually even get to the Ragnarok ship. Although it's a little bit tedious, you can go over to get a chocobo. You can run the chocobo across the shallow water and go all the way back around to where the Ragnarok ship is parked. And once you're there, you can go anywhere you want, including to go pick up, say, the Bahamut GF and even the Eden GF, I guess, although I haven't bothered to try to do that. I did go and get Bahamut, though. So that's the final side quest that I'll probably do. I'm not going to try to do like the Chocobo stuff or any of the random Queen of Cards stuff that's left. I'm content with my card collection and my GF collection right now. So I guess you can also draw any GFs that you might have missed, right, as you go through the castle. So maybe I'll get Eden before the end, but not by fighting any of the ultimate weapons, the final bosses, the bonus bosses, that is. Yeah.
all right. Well, I think that's a pretty good spot to end on. I guess I should also say that during our earlier discussion, I should say that the concept of androgyny, I think, is more explored in Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX
Mm-hmm.
than the idea of being trans. In particular, I'm thinking of beautiful Sephiroth, many feminine, elegant features about him. And then, of course, Kuja, who I didn't even know was male, for a pretty long amount of time while playing Final Fantasy IX as a 15-year-old. And I think that may also be something that's slightly culturally different, or at least was culturally different in Japan at that time, particularly with how males dressed and manifested and what was considered attractive. But I do think that has sort of maintained that the typical, or that like there is a greater acceptance and desirability for an androgynous look in Asian culture, and in particular Japan, compared to say in US/Western culture, though again, these things are always sliding. But so for next time, not in 4 weeks, we have to try and beat this game.
Yes.
And I have to admit that I actually, because of how onerous the Northern Cave was with Final Fantasy VII, I got to Sephiroth, and I lost to Seifer Sephiroth for the first time ever. But when I was a kid, I had Knights of the Round, so it was a joke. I had already beaten a much more difficult. I was just hanging on by the skin of my teeth throughout that entire playthrough, and I did not make it. And to my shame, I've got to maybe load it up and see if I can beat it at some point. But it takes hours to
Yes.
to get through the cave and then to get to those 3 final bosses. Luckily, we can activate save points that don't corrupt our save files in Ultimatia's Castle. But it's going to be difficult. I've played hard, but I don't think I've played as well as you. I didn't get to play as much cards because all of a sudden these absurd rules ruined cards about halfway through the game. Random and sudden death and all of that afflicted me. So I really need to play the game through again and do the card game. That's one thing I should say that I'm left with at the end. That even though I know we're moving on and we have to move on, that it'd be nice to play this game fresh right after I play
Yeah, that's an option.
like level 5 with Diablos.
All right.
That is, yeah, no, I mean, again, like we talked about yesterday, all reading is rereading, and so I just want to reread it even better. But thank you again, my friend. I think this battle is over and this side quest has been completed, and it's time that we saved our game and returned to our various realities.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Next time.